Okay, so we're going to start the workshop portion of our meeting, which will take us until 7:30, at which point we'll formally open the formal agenda. So with that, John Clark suggested we start discussion about the concept at this point of amending our laws to remove the requirement for parking, and I'm overgeneralizing, right? So John will get into more specifics. So take it away, John.
Yeah, no one's at this point proposing eliminating parking standards in the city, but there are discussions about at least reforming the parking standards in the city. There are early discussions, nothing is on the table yet. So I thought I'd give you some background information. Oh, why is that? I don't know. Here we go.
There we go.
Had too much of a pause, I guess. So this is a couple graphics from the Main Street Access Committee report. We'll start with Main Street.
Want to miss that?
The theory going back to the 70s was that the city would provide public parking along Main Street behind the businesses with big parking lots. And this is the legacy. You can see all the gray areas where there are parking lots that are run by the city. It's over 9 acres of land, over 400,000 square feet. That's a lot of land that's set aside for nothing but parking. And when the Main Street Access Committee looked at all this, they said, well, you know, there's a lot of complaints about not enough parking on Main Street. So they looked at a variety of different options. And the first option they took was to increase the amount of parking spaces without increasing the amount of asphalt. So take the existing parking lots, the existing streets, and make them more efficient. And by doing that, we found something in the neighborhood of 30-some spaces you could add just by striping or reconfiguring lots. And that would sort of help in the short term. And then there were sort of longer term considerations. I was going to show you some of those. One of them is that's a lot of land to set aside for parking that's just for parking. There's no reason why, for instance, you couldn't build above the parking lots and make those lands productive in terms of tax generation and business and housing and the rest of the things that the city needs. So another thing they did was to do a parking survey to figure out where things are bad and how bad they are. And so they picked a sunny October day right in the middle of the leaf season, which is sort of peak tourist time around here, on a Saturday afternoon. Sunny day. And they counted every car on the public streets. And if you look at it, there's over 1,600 spaces, public spaces, either on Main Street or within a block of Main Street. That's a lot of parking. And when you look at how they broke down, if you look where the red areas are, that's where things were filled. Main Street itself was more or less packed, and the East End parking lots were full or close to full. When you back off, the Eliza Street lot was filled, but the two Henry Street lots were not. The County Center lot, which is a big parking lot, was only 50% full. And there was a lot of parking on the side streets. So if you look at the percentages, if you want to park right in front of the store on Main Street, tough luck. But if you wanted to go a block or so away, there was parking. And that was on a peak day, not a Tuesday afternoon or a February Sunday or whatever. So the story was, the generation is that we don't have a severe problem yet, but it's getting there. The numbers are worse than they were in 2014 when the last parking survey was done. And especially on the East End, things were very tight. And, people don't want to walk down that hill and have to walk back up to a parking space on Henry Street, for instance. And you can park in the middle of Main Street where there was parking and take the free bus down if that's where you wanted to go, but people aren't inclined to do that. So there's different ways to attack the problem. One is to make the parking lots more efficient. This is an example of an inefficient parking lot. The county center lot has 92 total spaces. Takes up a huge chunk of that property, including the corner facing Main Street. You could reconfigure the lots, make it more efficient, and you get 113 spaces, 21 more parking spaces, and you can put a building and a green space on the front end of the parcel. So you could make that lot a lot more efficient and make it buildable and hide the parking at the same time. Right now, there is no landscaping in that lot, not a single tree. And you could provide landscaping as well and screen the parking to the back. So there's ways of doing that, coming up with efficient parking solutions that still involve surface lots. Another way is to build over the lot. Here's a concept study I did for the Henry Street lot behind the diner and Town Crier. Right now, there's 72 spaces there. They're used quite a bit. But you could put a 3 or maybe even a 4-story building on that parcel. It's in the commercial district. And put parking underneath. And even have apartments facing Henry Street so it doesn't look like a parking structure. It's all hidden behind. And you lose 5 parking spaces. So you could get the bulk of the parking would remain there and be available, and still have a productive lot in which you're not heating up asphalt all day in the summertime. So that's sort of the next step. And then there's another concept. You could go a little further and you could create actually more parking than there's there already. So this is a study we did for the parking lot down by the brewery off Churchill Street, which is not a great place to have a parking lot next to the creek frontage. But it's highly used. So this is where the biggest parking crunch is. So using the hill to take advantage of the hill, you could have an entrance on one level and an entrance on the other level, so you don't have to have internal ramps. It makes the parking more efficient. And you could fit 147 spaces on that parcel, where right now there's only 50-some. So you get a net gain of 94 spaces on 2 levels. And then you could also put 2 layers of housing above it and 2 layers of housing on the creek side to shield it from the creek trail. And so you get a net gain of parking plus housing and a nicer parcel, presumably, if you have good architecture. So there's sort of, and then you could go to the full-blown, just a parking structure with liner buildings. That's been proposed as well on the Eliza Street lot. So there's a lot of different options out there. The Access Committee proposed a 3-step process. Add more parking just by restriping and being more efficient. The second one is to look at paid parking. You can control parking by controlling the price. And since the primary crunch for parking is on the weekends when it's really tourist generation and not residentially generated, why not make the people who are visiting Beacon pay for some of the upkeep of all that parking? It's very expensive to maintain all those lots.
Yeah.
And Beacon taxpayers are paying for those lots, even though the peak parking crunch, where everybody complains that it is really generated by the tourists, not by the residents. And then the third one was to go to parking structures, which is expensive. It's a lot of people don't like parking structures. It takes up space. You can make them look nice. There's a variety of different ways you can shield the parking structures. A lot of people do good jobs on parking structures. It's better than surface lots because it's more land efficient, but it's still adding more parking to try to meet the demand rather than coming up with alternative strategies. So another way that people are addressing this issue is to look at parking requirements altogether, sort of
Yep.
rethink the big idea. And, they start with the question, what does it say about our values that housing for cars is mandatory in all proposed uses in the city and is almost always free? Whereas housing for people is restricted in many ways and always expensive. We're really valuing cars over people, or housing for cars instead of for people, because if you look at parking lots, they typically represent 10 to 20% of the total housing cost of a project, adds 17% to the average apartment's rent. And there's a lot of people who don't have cars or don't need cars, who can get by with walking and public transit in a place like Main Street in Beacon. And since lower income people are less likely to have cars, it's actually a very regressive way of looking at life, because the people least likely to use the parking are required to pay more for it out of their rents. The other argument is that our parking regulations in Beacon haven't been updated in any general way since the 1970s. And family formation was completely different in the 70s in terms of number of people per household and that sort of thing. So the parking standards we have are way overdone in terms of the amount of parking they require. So the average size of Beacon household has gone down 26% over that period, with a lot more one and two person households than there used to be. But we still require 2 spaces per every single family home, and in many places more than that for multifamily. The 2021 census, the American Community Values Census, 28% of Beacon's working class residents have 0 or 1 car available to them. So there's a lot of households out there being required to provide space for parking that don't need it.
Sorry, what was that statistic?
28% of Beacon's working age residents have 0 or 1 car available to them.
Where did that come from?
The American Community Survey, which is a 5-year rolling survey of people.
So 28% of households,
Beacon residents have 0 or 1 car available.
28% of residents have
Yeah.
0 or 1 car. Oh, okay.
Of working age. Working age.
Working age, yeah, they don't count the belows. Yes, there was a breakdown in which some people have a lot, but most people only have 1 or 2 cars per household. So one way of looking at this is to, there's several arguments that have been expressed about, and it's mainly in the context of our decision, talking about affordable housing, how to make more affordable housing. So if you require less parking, you can lower rents in theory, because they don't have to spend so much on land and upkeep of parking lots. They can put more units on a given piece of property than they could otherwise. And so that would drive down rents, or at least maybe stabilize rents. So several things have been discussed. One is to eliminate parking standards for affordable units. So as an incentive to build below market rate units, you wouldn't require parking for them. People who have less money have fewer cars, and it makes some sense. And it's like an incentive that you can provide for a developer, so that if they're providing 10% affordable units, then they would have to have 10% fewer cars in their parking lot. So that's one thought. The other thought is to just take our 1970 standards and look at them again, update them, lower the standards to what makes sense more now, across the board. So every category probably can be lowered to a certain degree, and still, because most of those standards in the 70s were based on suburban 1950s, everybody drives a car sort of mentality. And then the third one is to sort of look at it more critically. You could say, eliminate parking standards altogether. And if that sounds like a radical idea, 5 years ago, probably it was. But if you look around the country, hundreds of communities now have eliminated their mandatory parking requirements altogether. And they just work with developers to come up with what makes sense based on their parking studies and their needs. So Hudson in New York, Hartford, Buffalo, Boston, Bridgeport, Burlington are some of the examples here in the Northeast of significant-sized cities who have eliminated all parking standards from their code, minimum parking standards from their code. Kingston just adopted a new zoning code. Took them 3 years rewriting almost everything in the city. They eliminated parking standards in their code, minimum parking standards.
Has there been any follow-up studies?
Yeah, I was
after they
curious.
Eliminated.
They have. You know, a lot of them haven't been in place for a long period of time, but I know in Buffalo they did and they found that they haven't had any major problems. That the reduction of parking is something, and I don't have the number in my head offhand, but I think it's something like, has gone down like 30-some%. But people aren't complaining that there's a huge crunch in parking. You could also do it only in the business district where there is public parking available. So you wouldn't do it in the residential. Maybe you lower the standards for a single-family house or a multifamily dwelling, but you eliminate it in the main district where there is surplus parking and public parking available and side street parking and that sort of thing. Syracuse, Schenectady, Ithaca, Rochester, Scranton, and Brattleboro have all done that in their major central districts. There's a site out there, I can't remember the name of it, but it tracks all these things. And it's every week you hear about a new community either doing it or thinking about it. So that's been put on the table as a possibility for Beacon. Maybe the other two are, you sort of step into it, you eliminate it for affordable housing, you lower the parking standards, maybe eliminate it in certain areas of Main Street, or you give the planning board more ability to waive it in Main Street situations, and then you go from there. But those are all the things that are sort of talked about generally, but there's no
traction.
Well, there's disagreement.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's cautionary tales out there amongst people who have looked at it in the council and other people. So it's not on the verge of anything happening, but I thought it would be an interesting topic. You look at our agenda tonight, and parking is a big part of it. You know, the one on Fishkill Avenue is twice as much parking as building.
Yeah. I find it useful that you preface the start with an understanding of what's available, at least city parking, right?
Yeah.
So there's some context there to the start of a conversation about what, at least in my experience as a part of the board, is the biggest challenge, and that is how the laws are currently written in contrast to what it feels the reality is in terms of the fact that we tend to always end up finding parking after waiving, land banking, struggling, basically,
Right.
with the question of parking on just about every single application. So from at least my perspective, and I'd be curious what the rest of the board thinks, just that practical piece alone, I think warrants a look at our codes relative to modern parking, modern understanding of parking needs and how households operate, how, parking works nowadays as opposed to how the codes were written in the 70s dictate that we apply it now. So I see that as probably the sort of the starting point to conversation, right? I can understand people getting a little concerned about eliminating parking requirements altogether and wanting to sort of ease into the subject. But just from a practical standpoint, from what we do here on the planning board, I think we simply need to look at how the codes are written, how they're applied against the reality, because it's always a constant challenge, and it's a struggle, and it takes a lot of time out of our planning board meetings.
Yes, just to be clear, the Central Main Street District and the Linkage District and the Waterfront Development District have had their parking standards looked at and lowered
Yeah,
in the last few years, but the rest of the city,
yep,
the main residential district, the Fishkill Creek development, the general business district still has the 1970s versions, and you run into that problems there in
Right.
particular. But even Main Street you do.
yeah. All those lots that you showed in gray, that's all city-owned property?
What's that?
All the lots that you showed
Yes.
in gray, those are all,
Well, the county owns one, so.
the county owns
Yeah.
the county center? Yeah.
Right, So
So
they're
they're-
all publicly owned,
yeah.
but not, most of the other ones are, all the other ones are city lots.
Yeah. So again, I see it as basically two parts to the same kind of puzzle. One is just that, available parking, underutilized available parking. To some degree, you mentioned paid parking. I don't know if it's seen as a deterrent or a management device, rather a revenue-generating, maintenance, supporting device, paid parking.
But if, the way that paid parking works these days, they usually have computer-generated and variable times. So you chart out when the most peak periods are, and you charge more during those periods.
Sure.
So it actually, it does affect demand.
Huh?
People park a block or two away rather than, in the higher price spaces. You can make a differential between the parking spaces that are off-street and the one that are on Main Street, for instance.
So that type of mechanism has been proven to aid in shifting and balancing
Right.
a parking
And then,
distribution, if
again,
you will.
The money that's made is used for, number one, enforcement, and number two, maintenance of all the parking and street requirements
Yeah.
for parking, which is enormous, the amount of money the
Sure.
city spends on parking every year, and it's not accounted for by anybody except general taxation.
So could we, if we did that, could we afford new seats for the planning board members?
No, but you might afford more street trees along Main Street and better paved parking lots and,
Yeah, definitely advantages.
yes.
Are there strategies to, give residents like parking, like residents can park on these streets overnight?
Yes.
Or whatever the strategy is where you privilege the residents over, the visitors?
Yes, you can do a variety of things that, you can have resident deductions in the parking stand, in the parking metering system. You can have residential permits on side streets, for instance, where,
And is
people
that
park
something
every
that
day.
Beacon as a city can do? Or is there anything like where the state has input on parking?
Yes, the state has input. I don't know if our legal person is up on this one, but I know in certain cities, and I don't know about city law, but in village law, you actually have to have an approval from the state government to do residential parking permits.
Is that difficult to come by?
No, it's just a member item, and usually goes, that's my understanding. I'm not sure about that one, so don't quote me on that. But I do think that it's not entirely a local decision, especially if the state has financed certain street maintenance issues and things like that. Certainly on state highways, you would have to get some state permission.
So John, if the city were to develop the impetus to do something, right? At least from my perspective, I'll go back to this sort of practical aspect of the codes and how they're written and how they tend to challenge our applications, right? Would the council need to charge you with that and hire you for that part of a study?
Yes, they'd have to hire somebody to sort of comprehensively look at it. They'd come up with a good reasoned argument, and they would have to, if you say go to paid parking, you would get I know they looked at paid parking at the city council level 10 years ago or
Yeah.
some time ago, I can't remember, it was before my time. And, they had quotes for companies and estimates of how much revenue would come and how much it would cost up front, what the payback period would
Yeah.
be, and all that sort of thing. The same for if you're going to do parking structures, or, it's not hard to revise your code. I mean,
Yeah.
it is hard. It's always hard to change law, but it's not millions of dollars.
Yeah.
So more than likely, the easiest thing would be to update the 70 standards to something
Yeah.
uniformly across the city that was updated.
Yeah.
And probably lower in requirements. I think the elimination of affordable parking requirements would be a good first step.
Yeah.
Because that's what everybody's complaining about, is the lack of affordable housing. Well, if the developer is willing to do below market rates, they should get a benefit from that.
Yeah. Yeah, so the reason I ask is I'm just curious, because this is, I think, an important conversation. And it obviously would take, the council to sort of generate some energy around this, to ask a consultant, you more than likely, to start to look at whatever aspects they think are appropriate
Right.
of what we just talked about, because you covered quite a gamut. I don't know how we end up getting there, but certainly worth having conversations with council members and
Right.
the mayor to see where they land on it and whether they want to take it up. So, but yeah, I think it's definitely an important, again, I continue to go back to how we, just about every month,
Yes.
struggle in the discussion about the requirements for parking. And I don't know, I personally would like to see the council start there. And then, move on to other bigger topics.
There's a lot of lots on Main Street that absolutely cannot provide parking.
Yeah,
They just can't. Because they're so small that if you put a building on it, I mean, first of all, if you put a parking lot in it, you get like 8 spaces. And then there would be no building there, so you would just,
we come up
there has
against,
to be exceptions and parking requirements that acknowledge that a lot of, at least the Main Street lots, don't have any room for parking, and
Yep.
they have to have street parking or public parking
Yep.
as a backup. And if you want those lots filled in, you don't want empty lots fronting Main Street or one-story buildings facing Main Street, that you have to have parking exceptions.
Yeah.
The board has often exempted commercial space from the parking requirement. The code allows us to do that on the central Main Street district, and just required residential parking.
yeah,
So that would be another thing. You remove minimum parking standards for commercial space, at least up to a certain degree, or if they don't have room for parking.
So when you make reference to communities removing minimum parking standards, there's almost certainly more than one approach, but are we talking about just eliminating hard and fast written requirements that are written along the lines of, say, 2 parking spots per single family unit, or, our formula for multifamily dwellings?
Right.
Or is there still some underlying or residual requirement to address parking on a more fact-specific?
I think it depends on the community. Some just eliminate it and assume that and certainly in certain districts, the developer will provide parking because otherwise they won't be able to get a bank loan or they won't be able to rent their spaces. And so they end up doing it anyway, but they do it to what they think is appropriate for their land. Other places, I know, I've heard that Buffalo does it by negotiation, essentially. They do a parking study, they determine what is appropriate, and through a seeker process, I assume, they determine that this is the right amount of parking for that space by use and area and surrounding viability of off-street parking, and they come up with a solution for each space. But I think there's a lot of them that just say, we're going to leave it up to the developers, and they'll provide sufficient parking, and we provide backup parking based on their certain circumstances.
Well, it would seem like there's got to be some interplay with or consideration of what's also going on with street parking, because to give, one example, if someone's putting in a building and there's no street parking available,
Right.
you've got a narrow street, it's a net standing zone, you've got a situation where the private incentive there's going to be a private incentive structure there to provide enough parking
Yes.
that it's not an issue for building residents, whereas if you're on a street that has available public parking, that may in effect be simply increasing public cost or shifting private cost to public cost, it would be interesting to see more specific proposals.
Yes.
Yeah.
I guess.
I haven't, I've only dug into it a little bit.
Karen, to your question, the city of Beacon would need home rule legislation from the state of New York in order to get a residential parking pass permit system.
Is that kind of like a matter of course thing, like we ask our representative, or?
Yeah, it would be through the whole home rule legislation process, so you need to ask the local representative, they have to introduce it, we have to provide them with a draft bill, and so there's a little bit of a process to it, but in order to, we would need to do more research to find out the entire process, but.
I know that Ossining has it. In Ossining, you have permits to park on streets,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, it looks like there's several communities across the state that have it. It would just, we need to look into the specific process.
Well, we got to move on, but
Yes.
thank you, Tom. And, yeah, I think, David, you make a good point. That's sort of what I was getting to is, how do we get to the point of even the city council considering entering into studies just exactly like what you talk about?
Can I?
Yeah, please.
As things stand, we've got parking requirements in place where a substantial part of, or a substantial proportion of the properties in the city are not in compliance with them.
Right,
It seems like it would be a good idea to address that.
totally. Yeah, agreed.
And the one thing I'd encourage is not to base long-term decisions like this on anecdotal things, but to study it, analyze it with the specific lots and buildings and demand that we
Yep.
have in this building and the development potential, because what I'm afraid of is it will be giving away things that are public and not ever being able to reclaim them.
Okay,